Yeah, we were discussing this week, or this month, 1619 project and whether it's good history or not. Some people want to redefine American history as being more based on racism and practice of slavery than liberty and concepts of a republic. Maybe history is a bit more complicated, and maybe we need somebody who can give us more details. And we will see if our guest and our speaker is ready to do so.
Okay.
Dr. Philip Schoenberg, professor of government, and here's to discuss this 1619 project history.
Somebody's talking, please.
Can you have attention, please?
Yeah.
It's the 1619 project, good history. America is built on a lie, so says Nicole Hannah-Jones, the originator, the editor and promoter of the 1619 project, published by the New York Times, one of America's great and leading newspapers. George Washington and other founding fathers fought the American Revolution to have the right to own slaves. Hannah-Jones argues that slavery is the center to the American story, not the progress of liberty. The date comes in the year 1619, when slaves were first introduced into the colony of Virginia. Over the past 2 generations, mainstream American scholarship has become more inclusive by increasingly incorporating the latest scholarship on racism and slavery into the overall story of the American experience. Instead of turning a blind eye and trying to pretend that it never happened, no longer do popular histories, great biographies, and humble historic sites celebrate just the upside of the American experience, but also the downside as well. Today, the lives and experiences of the slaves are incorporated into biographies, histories, and presentations as never before. Even the cinema reflects this with such popular movies as Antebellum, Belle, Brother Future, 13 Years a Slave, The Django Unchained, Amistad, Harriet, Glory starring Denzel Washington, and Steven Spielberg's Lincoln. Juneteenth, the 12th new federal holiday in 2021, is now an annual holiday observing the end of slavery in the U.S. It marks the day when news of the emancipation reached slaves in the deepest parts of the former Confederacy in Galveston, Texas. Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia this week, lined with statues commemorating the heroes of the Confederacy, witnessed the unthinkable. The white governor of the state of Virginia and the black mayor of the city of Richmond succeeded in removing the Robert E. Lee Monument from Monument Avenue as no longer appropriate. Then why the controversy? First, we have the challenge to history posed by the 1619 project. We're now going to look at first the 2 essays, Hannah-Jones' introduction to what this project is about, that she commissioned. Claim number 1, the story of America is a story of oppression instead of the ascent of liberty. The 1619 project of the New York Times Magazine, directed by Nicole Hannah-Jones, attempts to reframe an understanding of American history by alleging the central seminal event in the founding of the United States was the first importation of enslaved Africans to Virginia in 1619, and not the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Nicole Hannah-Jones chooses to ignore that 1619 was also the same year that the proprietors of the colony of Virginia granted the settlers some measure of democracy, liberty, and self-government by setting up the House of Burgesses, a legislative body to make the laws. They did this as practical businessmen in order to attract settlers from England who were used to some input in government. At the time, liberty was being extinguished in much of Europe and was an unknown concept in the rest of the world. Eric Foner, a historian of the left, explains in the story of American freedom how the concept of liberty, imperfect as it was and still is, has improved over the generations. Claim number 2. The founding fathers of America launched the American Revolution to protect slavery, not to defend liberty. When challenged by scholarly critics, the response to Nicole Hannah-Jones has been absolute refusal to make any correction whatsoever, except to amend one statement. She changed her initial claim that all the founding fathers fought to preserve slavery, the source of their wealth, not liberty, in the war for independence, from all to some, without ever explaining who the some were. They did this in response to the growing calls to abolish slavery throughout the British Empire. Therefore, we have the battle of the experts. What are Nicole Hannah-Jones' credentials? According to Wikipedia, Nicole Hannah-Jones is an African-American, an investigative journalist known for her coverage of civil rights. In 2015, she became a staff writer for the New York Times. In 2017, she was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship, which said that she was simply a genius. $500,000. And she is now the inaugural Knight Chair in Race and Journalism at the Howard University of Communications, America's leading Black university, where she will also found the Center for Journalism and Democracy. Therefore, we are left with 2 questions. She knows how to investigate, but does she know how to do historical research? Does she deserve to get the Pulitzer Prize for commentary for her work for the 1619 Project? Hannah-Jones, in response to critics, has been aggressive of their credentials. And who are they? First, we have the white critics. December 2019, the New York Times published a letter signed by 5 leading historians of American history that demanded, quote, prominent corrections of all the errors and distortions they saw presented in the 1619 Project, end quote. These historians include the Princeton professor James McPherson, the 1986 Pulitzer Prize winner for the battle cry of freedom on the Civil War. His Princeton University colleague, Sean Wiolentz, who received the 2020 Thomas A. Cooley Book Prize for No Property in Man, Slavery, Anti-Slavery at the Nation's Founding. And CUNY professor James Oakes, the winner of the 2008 Lerman Lincoln Prize, Abraham Lincoln, the triumph of anti-slavery politics. And in 2013 received again the Lerman Lincoln Prize for Freedom National, the destruction of slavery in the United States, 1861 to 1865. Then we have Alan C. Guzlo, an American historian who teaches history at Princeton University. As a leading Lincoln expert, he has been a one-man crusader in writing several essays, attacking the inaccuracies of his statements and misinterpretations of the 1619 Project, published in various magazines and newspapers. And then who am I to challenge Nicole Hannah-Jones? I have a PhD in Middle Eastern history, so I know what is expected of a professional historian, although that did not give me the content for this my speech today. Thanks to the Gilded Lehrman Institute, I did postgraduate work on the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln economics at Gettysburg College under Gabor Barat, and slavery under the world's greatest scholar on the subject, David Bryan Davis at Yale University. I've also viewed several exhibitions on slavery at the New York Historical Society, in New York City, and New York State, as well as the literature on the Civil War, especially on Abraham Lincoln. I have been an enthusiastic member of the Lincoln Group of New York for many years, and I'm such a Lincolnophile that I even became a Lincoln reenactor. My first paid gig was for $50. Then we have the Black critics. Hannah Nicole Jones personally attacked the conservative African-American academics and journalists who launched a competing 1776 project to offer a counter-narrative. In January 2020, Leslie M. Harris, an African-American herself, specializing in the study of New York City slavery, and professor at Northwestern University in Chicago area, who had been used as the historical expert and consultant in the project, Nicola Hannah Jones, wrote that she had warned her that the American Revolution was not caused by the colonial resistance to any proposed abolition of slavery. And this endangered the project's aim of showing that American history major seminal event was slavery. Second, we have the battle of the evidence. According to Philip W. Magnus, an economic historian, Nicole Hannah Jones used the Google approach to history. She simply went online to find evidence after the fact to support her negative narrative of America instead of looking at all the data and previous scholarship, which might have forced her to rethink her position. For the American Revolution, Nicole Hannah Jones was unable to find a single statement said in public or written in private that any American colonial slave owner declared he was fighting to preserve his right to own slaves, because he was afraid his British overlords would force him to give up his human property.
Bill,
Yeah.
can I trouble you to stand up? We can.
No. I can move this way if you like.
You can enunciate better.
I'm announcing. I will turn this way a little bit so you can see. Actually, we can move this over. Sir, can we move this over? Just face this a little bit over here. Yeah, okay. Point taken. Thank you, Mr. Yee. In contrast, for the Civil War, every ordinance of succession passed by each succeeding state in 1860 and 1861 justified succession for the Union to fight for the right to own slaves. Public speeches and private communications explicitly restated this fact, as did the Constitution of the Confederate States of America. After the secessionists lost the Civil War, they repackaged their fight to preserve slavery as the lost cause, as a noble fight for liberty. Hannah Jones then quotes a proclamation by Lord Dunmore, the colonial governor of Virginia, in late 1776. He offered to free slaves owned by plantation owners in rebellion to the crown, but not those held by the loyalists. The American colonists responded by promising the same thing, not only to free the slaves of the Tories, but even of that of patriotic plantation owners, who they would then give compensation to. Neither side was going to abolish slavery, but offering slaves their freedom to fight on your side and deprive the enemy of their labor was standard technique. Failing to find any real evidence at home to support her thesis, Nicole Hannah-Jones turned her attention abroad to England. She claimed the slave owners were worried about the 1772 decision by Lord Mansfield in the British legal case of Somerset versus Stewart. His decision applied to one slave in one case in England, not to the American Caribbean colonies. He ruled slavery was not established by law in England, so any slave in England could automatically claim his or her freedom. According to my colleague, Dr. Robert Luster, the slave owners still imported slaves, but they were now treated as servants who were paid with lodgings of their own and days off. At one point, there were 100,000 of these Black immigrants who were welcomed as fellow Protestants by the white community. When the slave trade was ended by the British Parliament, they intermarried and disappeared as a group. Like any immigrant group, they and their descendants bettered themselves and experienced upward mobility. This is in contrast to the 1857 Dred Scott decision authored by the American Chief Justice, Roger P. Taney, that reassured American slave owners and declared the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act unconstitutional, upending the status of slavery throughout the entire country in favor of the rights of slave owners to bring their human property anywhere. The West Indian plantation owners were a formidable political bloc in the British Parliament that zealously protected their interests very successfully throughout the 18th century. However, they were undermined by international economic revolution and a domestic political revolution, which sapped their political power. Napoleon, in an effort to break the British blockade of the European continent, tried to find substitutes for various products. The sugarcane proved to be an ideal substitute for sugar cane. They are both identical in their chemicals, their sugars. The free white farmers of Europe were able to grow sugar cheaper than the slaves of the Caribbean. This undermined plantation slavery, which was no longer profitable. Furthermore, the Reform Bill 1832 in England eliminated rotten boroughs and hence the exaggerated influence of the Caribbean slave owners in the British Parliament. In the next year, in 1833, the British Parliament abolished slavery throughout the entire British Empire. According to my colleague, Dr. Robert Lester,
What year is this?
1833. According to my colleague, Dr. Robert Lester, only the big shots in the British West Indies who had good lawyers and the right political connections received some compensation money. Their lawyers did better than their clients, while the former slaves simply walked off the plantations. Finally, the American Revolution had already been set in motion by 1765 because of the Stamp Act in 1765 and then the Tea Act passed by the British Parliament in 1773. The Stamp Act Congress that met in New York City united the various colonies to protest no taxation without representation. The Boston, New York Tea Parties had taken place respectively in 1773 and 1774. Claim number 3, slavery is America's original sin. Slavery was not unique to the United States. Only 4% of the slaves imported from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean went to the 13 colonies. The others were simply worked to death in the rest of the Americas. American slave owners treated their slaves slightly better, so they relied upon natural increase instead of imports. Thomas Jefferson maintained his wealthy lifestyle by selling off the natural increase of his slaves, some as young as 7 years of age. And slavery was not original to America. At the time, 1619, slavery was accepted as an institution on every continent except Antarctica, going back to the beginnings of human civilization, practiced by every creed, every nation, and every race on the planet without question. The American Indians also had slaves. And technically, the 20 unfortunate Angolans who were sold as indentured servants, not as slaves, in 1619 in Virginia. It would take a few years before their successors in bondage would be legally transformed into slaves. What is original to America is that the first anti-slavery manifesto was published in 1733 in my hometown of Flushing, where I am speaking right now. The first attack on slavery anywhere in the world. Within a century, in 1833, slavery will be abolished within the British Empire. Today, slavery has been abolished officially throughout the world, though it still currently exists. It is Western civilization that has led the way in abolishing slavery. Claim number 4, America is a racist country. The primary assumption of the 1619 Project is that America still remains a racist country. However, current statistics belie this fact, as intermarriage between different ethnic, religious, and racial groups is at an all-time high. Since the 1965 immigration reform, the United States has become the world's greatest immigration magnet, attracting a rainbow of immigrants that have done extraordinarily well in America. This nation, the American nation, us, elected Barack Obama, the son of a Kenyan black and an American white, as its 24th president. Kamala Harris, the current vice president of the United States, is of Asian and African American background, a Baptist who is married to a white Jewish guy. How more multicultural, ecumenical can you get? Claim number 5, Lincoln was a racist who sabotaged emancipation. Then Nicole Hannah-Jones proceeds to do a hatchet job at Abraham Lincoln. She is absolutely correct that the president continued to advocate colonization even after he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. He had been an advocate since his earliest days in politics. Archives in foreign countries reveal the efforts of the Lincoln administration to pursue this even after he began to abolish slavery. Lincoln always advocated this on a voluntary basis, as one of several avenues they pursued in the hope of creating a better future for African Americans after the Civil War. As Alan C. Guzlo puts it, this racist president convinced the American people to add emancipation as a second war aim, in addition to preserving the Union. And in issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, quote, Lincoln was forced to chart a difficult political course, attempting to placate various wings of his coalition, of which abolitionists were only one part, while also leading the Union in one of the most momentous wars in history. Emancipation was politically risky, and Lincoln could not have realistically have done more, end quote. Lincoln achieved the greatest freeing of slaves in world history in a tightly drawn legalistic document, the Emancipation Proclamation. Using his legal background, he designed it so that it could survive a Supreme Court headed by Chief Justice Roger Taney, had made legal rulings in favor of slavery. Slavery received its final death blow by the passage of the 13th Amendment that Lincoln personally lobbied Congress, as dramatized in Steven Spielberg's motion picture, Lincoln. In honoring the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. noted that, quote, when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, it was not the act of an opportunistic politician, end quote. It was no accident that a year later, they gave I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Did Nicole Hannah-Jones prove her case that slavery, not liberty, is central to America's story? I would say not. Second, we have the challenge of economics. We're going to look at the second essay commissioned by Nicole Hannah-Jones, given to Matthew Desmond to write the article on slavery's connection to capitalism. According to Wikipedia, Matthew Desmond is an American sociologist and the Morris P. Doring Professor of Sociology at Princeton University, where he is also the principal investigator of the Eviction Lab. Desmond was awarded a Harvey Fellowship in 2006, and just like Hannah-Jones, received a MacArthur Fellowship in 2015. He won the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction, the 2017 Penn John Kenneth Galbraith Award, and the 2016 National Book Critics Award for his work, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City. With such an impressive academic credential awards, was Matthew Desmond able to transfer his expertise as a student of 21st century sociology into becoming an expert in economics of the 19th century. Claim number 6, slavery birthed capitalism. Claim number 6, slavery birthed capitalism. Matthew Desmond, 1619 essay is entitled, American Capitalism is Brutal. You could trace that to the plantation. Made the United States wealthy, and American capitalism was originated by plantation slavery. So what does he state? First, the way capitalism and slavery operate is radically different from each other. Slavery is based upon the ownership of human tools of production, as Aristotle defined slavery 2,500 years ago in ancient Athens. In contrast to a free market or employee, to a free worker or employee, a slave cannot set his hours, protest his work condition, choose when to work or when to work, and leave his situation. He also faces physical punishment that may involve whipping, mutilation, even death. In countless narratives of slaves and ex-slaves, women were raped by their masters or forced into a non-consensual sexual relationship, such as Thomas Jefferson did with Sally Hemings. A slave cannot run away from punishment, while an employee can leave an abusive employer and situation anytime. A slave is deprived of his freedom of choice, deprived of the fruits of labor, and even deprived of his life. Capitalism consists of voluntary contracts and mutual exchanges of voluntary agreements that involve trust. Either party is free to leave or to better his situation. Capitalism is found on the basis of the market, the right to one's own labor or business enterprise, a mutual agreement known as the right to contract or the right to choose. This is America, where we always have a choice, in which there is constant competition. Businesses in search of workers and customers, while customers have a whole range of options, and workers can choose their employers. No one forces you to work for Amazon and Walmart or shop at either place. An employee is always free to better his situation. Slavery was a well-established institution going back to time immemorial. In contrast to capitalism, is a more recent origin. Capitalism developed in Renaissance Europe with its concepts of double entry bookkeeping, insurance, banks, corporations with stock markets, with stock certificates and bonds traded on stock markets, and banks where people could save and borrow. Matthew Desmond erroneously repeats the claim of the NHC, the new history of capitalism, that capitalism and its modern business practices originated on the slave plantations in the antebellum South, instead of the reverse of adopting these capitalistic practices. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Adam Smith of Scotland, Richard Cobden of England, and Frederick Bastiat of France explained how capitalism worked along with concepts of the free market, the liberal tradition, free trade, and Lassie economics. They agreed with the abolitionists of their time, in which they all viewed slavery as both morally and economically repugnant. Pro-slavery theorists in the antebellum South held capitalism in contempt. In his book, Sociology for the South, published in 1854, George Fitzhugh developed the theory of surplus value, a decade before Karl Marx, in which he argued that slaves kept more of what they produced than the wages paid to a free laborer. Therefore, Fitzhugh argued that slavery was an idealized form of socialism. In the decade before the Civil War, Fitzhugh saw the concept of the free market of capitalism as the greatest danger to slavery itself because it emphasized the power of the individual. Matthew Desmond also goes off on irrelevant tangents. He starts off his essay with a flawed example of capitalistic exploitation by citing Martin Shkreli, a former hedge fund manager who's doing time in jail for fraud and has been denounced for his unscrupulous raising of drug prices. The justice system worked because the guy is being punished. In the words of Phil W. Magnus, Matthew Desmond ends his essay by demanding that because of capitalism's supposed slavery-infused legacy, we must have the nationalization of healthcare and other economic sectors, social and central planning of industry around labor activism, and even a plethora of climate change policies to bring about social justice. Claim number 7. Slavery, not capitalism, made America rich. Alas, Matthew Desmond may be an ace in sociology and investigating the underside of American life in the 21st century. But he's out of his depth when it comes to the economics of the 19th century, an entirely different field outside of his expertise. Matthew Desmond did not consult his colleagues in the Princeton University History Department, three who have been active in opposing the 1619 project. Instead, he neither consulted the economics department of his own university. Instead, Matthew Desmond resourced the NHC, the New History of Capitalism, a Marxist school of thought that began in 2010, which blatantly ignores half a century of scholarship on slavery by both Marxist and non-Marxist economists as irrelevant. The NHC, or New History School of Capitalism, uses screws scholarship, history, and economics by playing loosely and ambiguously with definitions to attack and blame the free market as the fault of capitalism without really explaining its links to slavery. It suffers from ideological and methodological isolation, which ignores other approaches and opinions. Its inept misuse of economic data to make unsupported empirical statements, and its heavy anti-capitalistic political perspective. Matthew Desmond, again, whose professional credentials are in 21st century sociology, substitutes ideology, polemics, and politics in place of economics, mathematics, and statistics that he fails to understand. He substitutes his opinions for the facts. As a consequence, he copies the errors of the NHC in exaggerating the importance of cotton slavery in the American economy. For example, he counts several intermediate economic flows as separate entities instead of different stages of processing the same product. As a result, he erroneously repeats the NHC's claim that cotton in the South contributed to more than half the gross national product before the Civil War instead of 5 to 6%. The same as banking up in the North did at the time. While slavery benefited a few on top of the South, capitalism benefited a much larger segment of the population in the North. Roger Kennedy, director of the National Park System, and then the Smithsonian Institution's Museum of National History, argued that President Thomas Jefferson caused the Civil War. His policy on land favored the selling of federal lands to large landowners at access to credit over that of small individual farmers who relied upon cash. As a result, this encouraged the spread of slavery to cultivate new lands. As a result, the yeoman farmers, supposedly idealized by Jefferson, the backbone of the American Republic, were pushed to more mountainous and fertile lands to farm, and less fertile lands to farm. According to Ellen C. Guzlow, the middle class was larger and more diverse in the North than in the South. People flocked to the factories in the North because the work was easier, safer, and paid better than agriculture. South only had Richmond as a major industrial center. North had a better and more extensive system of railroads that were interconnected than the South. New York State by itself had more bank deposits and encouraged more commercial transactions in the whole of the South. The North was far more urbanized, although it remained predominantly agriculture, where the South had only two great cities, Baltimore and New Orleans. A new plow transformed the great American desert of the Midwest into the breadbasket of the world. Immigrants flocked to the North, where they did not have to compete with slave labor. Innovation was sent to the North, North's diverse economy, where the South bet its future on monoculture, or one crop, king cotton. Did Matthew Desmond prove the Kiss case that slavery birthed capitalism and made America rich? I say not. Claim number 3, we have the challenge of the curriculum. Claim number 8, we need heroes that are worthy of us. And I agree with that claim, we do. However, as Alan Dershowitz, a noted defender of the Bill of Rights, has noted, the effect of cancel culture rewrite history, not as it was, but as they wish it had been, is manifested most directly by the tearing down of statues, the renaming of buildings, and the canceling historic figures who have a mixed record of good and bad. Of course, all historical figures have mixed records, at least to some degree. A better approach is the one taken by Yale's University Committee to establish principles on renaming the Calhoun College, a dormitory that was set up in 2016. By the way, I stayed at that dormitory when I was studying slavery under Professor Davis. It is named for South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun, an advocate for both states' rights, succession, and slavery, and a member of Yale's class 1804. The committee adopted the standard of principal legacy, defining it as the lasting effects that cause a name to be remembered. The committee wrote that we ask about a namesake's principal legacies because human lives, as Walt Whitman wrote, are large, they contain multitudes. So, for example, the report authors say we rightly remember Frederick Douglass, the Black abolitionist, as an advocate and as an abolitionist for civil rights, but not for saying that Native Americans were easily contented with small things such as blankets and would simply cease to exist. Therefore, the committee reached the conclusion to rename the dormitory after Grace Hopper, a computer pioneer who received a PhD in mathematics from Yale University in 1934. Under this standard, George Washington would pass muster, even though, like most wealthy Virginians of his time, he owned slaves. He did spend the last 2 years of his life to ensure that the more than 100 slaves he personally owned would be freed after his death. Washington was a model leader that successfully launched a new country, a united country, and a Republican form of government that has endured as a model of liberty, pluralism, and tolerance. Claim number 9, history should be politicized, revolutionized, and weaponized for the good of the American soul. Philip W. Magdis noted that Hannah Jones' own public comments pivoted between touting her work as the culmination of rigorous historical scholarship and an exercise in advocacy journalism, seemingly as the occasion demanded in her interviews. The 1619 Project, it seemed, it could serve as both an enduring long-term curriculum for high school and college classrooms and an activist manual. Unfortunately, the blending of these two competing aims usually results in the sacrifice of scholarly standards in the service of ideological objectives, not by design, but by necessity. 2, reconcile the irreducible complexities of the past to a more simplistic political narrative. The authors of the 1619 Project have committed educational historical malpractice to advance their hidden woke agendas, blame the white people, and America is evil. They have also downgraded and omitted entirely the roles of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights advocates of the 20th century and that of the 19th century abolitionists. Sadly, more than 160 school districts, some of the biggest in the nation, have adopted the spin-off curriculum for the 1619 Project that has been developed to advance this woke rectification of history that poses a social justice. The curriculum spreads woke ignorance, imposes ideology, a rush to judgment, and simplifies complex stories by leaving out details and nuances that would aid us in our understanding of the past. In conclusion, Professor Leslie M. Harris of the Northwestern University, the historical consultant to the 1619 Project, feared, I was concerned that critics would use the overstated claim that the American Revolution was a defense of slavery to discredit the entire undertaking of the 1619 Project's central thesis that slavery is central to understanding the American experience. Unfortunately, in my opinion, this is exactly what happened when the 2 key essays were assigned to outstanding intellectuals out of their depth in fields that they were not experts in. Ideology, politics, and polemics make for bad history. James Robbins wrote, the United States is the realization of Jefferson's empire of liberty. Though the founding fathers were flawed, there were great men who left a great legacy. We do not suffer the American nightmare. We live the American dream. For all its faults, for all its past mistakes, for all its present foibles, our country is still worth all the devotion we can muster. Thank you very much. I most appreciate that everybody was eating so quietly.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
You mentioned in your speech that slavery is still practiced in some parts of the world. Where?
It's well, starting with our own country. There are tens of thousands of women held as sex slaves throughout this country. Many of them illegal aliens, but also have runaways, and there's a whole export business throughout the world. Where they import as entertainers and so on, but where someone holds their passport so they cannot leave. I mean, if you cannot leave your place of employment, then you're a slave.
Oh, by the way, John Chodes who was a late great libertarian, wrote a lot of revisionist history on the reconstructive period of the United
What
States.
is your point?
My point is that he would disagree with a lot of things that you're saying.
Well, what would you disagree
Well,
about?
first of all, he would say that he mentions in his writings uh, that some of the slaves were treated very well in the sense that they were able to become capitalists themselves when they learned the trade and they were able to practice it on the plantation.
Actually, there was a good study, which I admitted this study, but there's a study called Time on the Cross, which examined the cleometrics of the cotton economy. He argued that slave labor on cotton, tobacco, and sugar plantations was more efficient than that done on small farms, where a gang of slaves, 16 or more, working uh, could outproduce the free farmers. But he said the slaves made the best of a bad situation. They often entered into contracts where they received part. One more, excuse me. Let me finish here. He entered into positive contracts. They were offered positive incentives, such as a day off, getting some money. But again, they were not free to leave. And for example, in the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, he worked as a carpenter. He would make $10 a week. He would return all $10 to his owner, who would then give him back $1 for him to live on.
Okay, and he also said that Lincoln was a tyrant.
Excuse me, we're gonna move on to that. That's irrelevant to our discussion for today. It's irrelevant to our discussion. Excuse me. Let's give other people a chance. We'll get back to it. Excuse me. Well, you can disagree with me. I want to move on to give other people a chance. You do not have the right to dominate the discussion. Excuse me.
I'm just asking. I'm telling you something.
Excuse me. I acknowledge you. I said I would get back to you, so I want to give other people a chance.
So in technology, there's when a new program or software is released, when you look at the features that come out as the first, that are part of the initial release, that shows the values and the goals of its creators. So couldn't you make an argument, because slavery was in the founding document of the United States, that one of the values it started with was that of slavery?
You know what? I would agree with you on that. They use a lot of euphemisms, but that was the price they had to pay to unite the nation, the 13 colonies. Emancipation was already a process taking place even as they were writing the Declaration of Independence. Slavery was still legal in all the 13 colonies, but there was already a move on in the northern areas to start getting rid of slavery. Let me mention that slavery was very profitable in many areas. You have the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantation, which last year eliminated the Providence Plantation. Albany County in upstate New York had the greatest percentage of slaves of any county, 37%. New York County, of which Manhattan Island is 25%. So I would agree with you, but that's why they were not explicit. They were being euphemistic about it. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
My question is about the sequence through which this project came into being. Normally, I'm not an academic, but I normally think that change in academic thinking is usually preceded by an academic book or paper or set of writings, and then you get a popularization in a newspaper. But this 1619 project came to be in August of 2019 in the New York Times, and the writers and contributors who didn't seem to just offer to open a conversation about a new perspective on that. They were very aggressively asserting of this new conclusion or this new history of capitalism approach to the subject matter. What do you think of the sequencing of this, and this thing occurring out of the
Okay,
blue?
let me make a distinction here. You don't have to be a historian to write history. You know, you follow the rules of having evidence.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember the name of a very prominent far left guy who in his old retired from writing his far left column. His old age, in his 80s, he learned Greek, ancient Greek, in order to do a study on Socrates, who he argued was a threat to Athens, and justly, and Athens was just justified having executed as a threat to its democracy. But he trained himself. He read the evidence directly. These people that run, Philip W. Magnus said that most of the essays are good, especially the ones in the 20th century, because these were written by people that were in the fields. You had, but whereas sadly, Nicole Hannah Jones and Desmond were writing out of their fields. So you had the agenda first, and you had everything else follows.
And the other question or quick opinion of mine is that 1619 project to me had much more to do with the 2020 election in the year that followed the publication of 2019. They were trying to set up a narrative about what America really is or where it really came from in order to say we need to get rid of the last vestige of that kind of thinking. More or less the current president, the previous president, and bringing the new president who represents the enlightened feelings of the people who put together the project. Do you think the 1619 project was overly influenced by the politics going into 2020?
Okay, Philip W. Magnus would agree with you. That says that was part of the hidden agenda was to influence that. Okay, I think let me see. Michelle, did you have another question?
That was the question.
Okay. Okay. Yes.
Good presentation.
Okay. Thank you.
Before
What?
I get to my question, you guys will find out that it's a misconception that slavery was highly profitable.
Go ahead.
They were ruling the richest. But Thomas Sowell pointed out that this is not so because the cost of slavery is just better than 90%. You have to feed them, guard them, all that. And then the 10%, whatever, it's hardly profitable because you gotta have a weather cost. That's what I was saying. The question I want to ask you, you mentioned that Jones cited the secession of the South as that the slavery is
Jones did not cite that. I said that there was no state in the American Revolution that said they were fighting for slavery, whereas comparing to the Civil War, they're very explicit about it. Continue.
right. Okay, but the question I want to ask you, maybe you know personally, what exactly precipitated the South to secede?
Okay, that's a very good question. The South, what happened was, you have to realize the 1860 election was a four-way election.
Was it what?
Four-way election. You had four different presidential candidates. Democratic Party was split into three factions that each ran a candidate. Stephen A. Douglas, Bell, and a third guy I forget at the moment, and had Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was sufficient for Abraham Lincoln to win almost all the northern states, and he was elected president. The South was afraid that what happened was Abraham Lincoln, as people in the South began to say, was afraid Lincoln would do something to abolish it. So I'm going to reassure you. Abraham Lincoln said, I'll even get Congress to pass an amendment to guarantee you the right to perpetually, that the federal government can never interfere with slavery in your state. But the South wanted to expand slavery. The South wanted to expand slavery. They wanted to expand slavery into the Caribbean and Mexico, take over those areas as new areas. So they were. The other thing is, you know something, You know, when somebody says slavery is not, it's like it's not profitable. That's a bunch of BS. Why? Well, why didn't they free their slaves? They're losing money. The clear metrics I mentioned before, called Time on the Cross, explicitly states they were making money. They were making money. Let me tell you. Let me say something else too. Uh, that was a myth spread by the slavery people. Say they're going to go for back. It's going to die off anyway. It's not going to die of its own, die a natural death by itself. That was a myth they were spreading. Let's take Thomas Jefferson, idealist, who actually argued in his younger days as a lawyer before the American Revolution. He got 2 or 3 slaves their freedom under the laws of Virginia. But he wrote the magnificent words of the Declaration of Independence. Notice he didn't say white people, he said all people, But he spoke a good game of how he was always for freeing the slaves, but he never got around to it. He was actually offered, he had 3 major opportunities to free his slaves. And he received an offer from Teodosco Kosciuszko, a Polish engineer, fought the American Revolution, whose will he drew up. Kosciuszko left almost entirely of his estate, $20,000, which on money today would be $20 million. Say, Jefferson, I'll give you this money to free your slaves. Most of these slaves that you can. Jefferson didn't take him up to the offer. He was making too much money from his nailery, where the teenage slaves are being worked against their will, and selling off the natural increase of his slaves to maintain his lifestyle. Okay, so let me answer another. So slavery was profitable, and so let me get back to Abraham Lincoln was a tyrant. The case can be made that Lincoln was a tyrant, but Lincoln was saying in his defense, are you going to let secessionists have free say in Maryland and in the border states to get them to leave the Union, to isolate Washington, D.C., to infiltrate the war effort? So you could make a good case that he did. In fact, the Supreme Court after the Civil War, because these cases take time, said so. They said that most of what he did was unconstitutional. But by that time, he said, Lincoln argued, I have to violate the Constitution in order to save it. By that time, the Civil War was over.
Yeah, but then, still, why did they secede? What was the proximate cause?
I just answered you. I answered you. They wanted to protect slavery. That is a direct cause.
You want to protect slavery?
Yes.
But what was threatening them?
Okay, what was threatening? Okay, what was threatening them was what they feared what might happen. Because you see, they were afraid, let's suppose if you have more and more free states, eventually they could eliminate that amendment. They could overrule the amendment. They said, okay, you had it for a period of time, but now we have enough that we can override. Remember that the Constitutional Amendment needs 3/4 of the states to be approved. And if they will gradually realize that, today we have 50 states, back the number of southern states that succeeded were 11. So eventually you could have had a majority outside this that could have abolished slavery. So that was a real genuine fear they had.
Now, there's going to be there is an ongoing debate over that matter. That's why this keeps coming up. All those statues around the country in the southern areas devoted to the Confederate cause, they also state bluntly states' rights as the criteria for why they entered the war. Others in that movement were specifically concerned about slavery, but there was an awful lot of support for the states' rights argument for the beginning of the Civil War and for secession. The other issue is that at the morning, my understanding, now I've mentioned this several times over the years, when Abraham Lincoln was sworn in as president that morning, most of the states that were practicing slavery were Union states, not Confederate states.
Okay.
The issue of slavery was not the issue because the Civil War hadn't even started yet. At any rate, I just wanted to bring that up. I think Robert wanted to mention something.
No, I was waiting for.
Okay, let me
Yeah,
respond.
you're
Let me first let me respond to John Clifton here. Okay. Uh, there's a wonderful book called Robert E. Lee and Me by Ty Sedell. Bone to the Bone, classic wasp, deep devout Southerner, raised on the glory and legend of Robert E. Lee, married, God help him, to a Northerner. But and he worshipped at Robert E. Lee. He went to Lee in Washington University, where they have this mausoleum of Robert E. Lee. He grew up worshiping at the ancestry, and he went along with this. But gradually, what happened was he began to realize, if you look at everything that the South ever said, it comes down to there's the good reason and then there's the real reason. Sounds good, but the real reason. Okay, again and again, it comes down to, let's start with Robert E. Lee himself. We have the legend that he really was opposed to slavery. He said, you know what? Arlington was one of the largest slave plantations in the state of Virginia. Not only that, his own slaves had won a court case against him that they were entitled to be emancipated because his father-in-law had stipulated within 5 years they should be freed. He was busy working his slaves to pay for to provide for his daughters to get married. Not only that, he was on leave from the U.S. Army for a year or two to bring the plantation up to snuff to make it more profitable. Not only that, there were 8 Virginian colonels in the U.S. Army at the time of the succession. One of them was his mentor, Winfield Scott, a Virginian, who asked him, I want you to take command of the Union Army. Of the 8 colonels, he was the only one that turned traitor. And let's say explicitly, he was fighting against, he killed more Americans than any other general did in American history. He was fighting for the Confederacy. He was fighting for the right for himself to own slaves. I also state also that you look at the order of succession, it says we're fighting not for the right for state rights, we're fighting to keep our slaves. You look at the orders of succession again and again. You look at the orders of succession. Okay?
But if you point out, let's be one of the counter statement that there was a book, I forget the title, and I reviewed it on other occasions, recollections of hundreds of soldiers and their correspondence with their families on the Confederate side or the Union side. And the overwhelming, the preponderant number of letters written by family members of the Confederate side, the soldiers to the families, the families to the soldiers, talked about the war in terms of states' rights, not in terms of retaining slavery.
Well, you know what? You're going to feel a lot better saying I'm fighting for state rights than I'm fighting to keep someone enslaved.
It's called a euphemism.
Yes, euphemism.
Well, this is private correspondence. They're not just.
Well, that's it. It's called a euphemism. It's a euphemism. It's a euphemism. You try to dress something up, which it ain't. They have the old saying, can you turn a pig into a silk purse?
And
still a
of
pig.
Of course, you could say the same thing about the other side too. That the Union side said we're fighting for one reason, and yet there are real reasons they want.
Okay.
All the United States.
Okay.
Or whatever negative thing.
Okay. Let me say this. In the correspondence of the Union soldiers, many of them said we're fighting to preserve the Union. A lot of them said I ain't fighting to free slaves, but for many of them it did become a crusade. 750,000 people died. We have now revised statistics. 750,000 people died. 200,000 African Americans, slaves and non-slaves, fought for the Union. When the Civil War broke out, the Southerners turned down orders by a few freed blacks to fight for their side. That puts a lie. If you're fighting for state rights, then you welcome some blacks. Only to the very end do they start thinking, okay, we'll need some blacks to help us fight. But that was turned down the turn the whole thing on the head. Why do we go get fight this war anyway? For slaves. Now we're enlisting slaves to slaves and offering them freedom.
So,
Yes.
now, contrary to popular belief, not everyone in the South owned slaves.
Of course.
Was that?
Most of them didn't.
Most of them did, exactly. But these other people, these rank and file, didn't they see these slaves as competing for, as cheap labor, competing for their jobs? And didn't they rebel against this like they did in California? Those Chinese were coming, they taking their jobs away. How come these people in the South didn't feel the same way? They're stealing my jobs, you know?
That's what happened is you have the selling ideology. You have people that aspired for upward mobility. I mean, Andrew Jackson was an orphan. The poorest, but he managed to through his being a lawyer, betting on horses, and raising good products. He built one of the largest plantations in the South. Andrew Johnson himself owned slaves upon occasion, even though he was opposed to plantation owners. And then you also have the feeling, okay, I always feel better than the blacks because they're slaves and I'm not. Also have to realize, let's take the experience. Both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis were born in the state of Kentucky. I'll answer your question now. State of Kentucky. And what happened was, because the land titles were not clear, Abraham Lincoln's father went up into free territory where the titles were clear, and Jefferson Davis' father went south, and were influenced by the way they were raised. Go ahead, yes. Oh, Abraham Lincoln's father. You had people that did complain in some parts of the South that they were competing against slave labor. That's why they might be opposed to it. You have to realize also under the laws, right of transit, before the Civil War, you could bring a slave into a free state up to, depending upon the state, 3 to 6 months, and then send them back. There used to be gangs of slaves that worked in southern parts of Illinois that would be imported for the season, and they'd go back before their residency expired. Yes, you had it. Let me ask William. William, do you have a question?
No, but you mentioned earlier,
Could speak up, please. I cannot hear. Speak up.
You mentioned someone wanting to keep slavery. Is that what I heard?
What's the question?
Is there any particular reason why someone wanted to keep slavery? Maybe that's the question if you did. Any particular reason why, knowing the outcome, knowing the reputation?
Of what?
You mentioned earlier today someone.
Okay, let me say this. Until the publication of that article, that essay in 1733 in Flushing here, no one had ever argued against slavery. People accepted it as a fact of life. They didn't know it was a sin because nobody considered it to be a sin. Although Islam and Judaism both said it was a virtue to free people, but they didn't say it was the only sin, in the case of Judaism, the only sin was if you enslaved a fellow Hebrew. Okay.
What about the abolitionists? I mean, people knew that slavery was wrong.
Well, let me explain. Abolitionists wanted to eliminate slavery. You had other people that said, we will stop the expansion of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like Abraham Lincoln. They figured that eventually slavery would strangle of its own accord if it could not expand. But again, that would be doubtful. But continue.
But what?
I said continue. We have another question?
No, that was
Okay, Mr. Yee?
That's not-
Alton, do you have another question?
Let me see. Well, okay. Getting back to the rank and file, were there any historic reports about these rank and file, uprisings, they protest slavery? I mean,
Well, you have
any kind of protest?
Well, we do have. There were counties that succeeded from the states that said, I worked with the Union. You have a movie made called The County of the Free State of Jones. It was about a county that succeeded. You had people from the various other states that went up north to fight in the Union armies. Just as you had so few people from the Union states that went to the south to fight in the Confederate armies. Uh, so there was opposition. Uh, uh, Governor, trying to remember his first name, Houston of Texas, the governor and president of the Republic of Texas, was opposed to slavery. Was opposed to succession. John Tyler, one of the president of the United States, was elected to the Confederate Congress, although he died before he could take his seat. So there was a whole, so there's a whole lot of stuff. I think we run out of stuff to talk about.
I just have one question.
Okay, yes.
What was the name of that movie with Daniel Day-Lewis and Leonardo DiCaprio? That was produced by, or directed by Martin Scorsese,
I don't remember.
about the Civil War.
Gangs of New York.
Gangs of New York, right, okay, I was just wondering.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, one and all. You've been a wonderful audience.
All right.